Hey detoxers, welcome to Disinfo Detox, the show that cuts through the lies and scrubs the propaganda from public discourse. Today, we're breaking through the corporate news narratives about President Donald Trump's proposal to have the U.S. overtake Gaza. Since the corporate media has consistently failed to inform the public on issues related to Israel and Gaza, I've invited Robin Andersen to the program. Robin Andersen is an award-winning writer, commentator, and professor at Fordham University's Department of Communication and Media Studies. She writes for Fair and Project Censored, a number of other publications, and is editor for the Routledge Focus book series on media and humanitarian action. Robin Andersen, welcome to Disinfo Detox.
Thanks. And congratulations on the new podcast.
Oh, thank you. I want to have you on because, Gaza remains, rightfully so, in the news. But of course, the corporate media has repeatedly failed to really inform the public about it. So I want to have you on here because you've been covering the media's coverage of Gaza and Israel basically since October 7th, 2023. So can you tell folks a little bit about, the work you've been doing covering the media since then and what you found?
Great. Sure, Nolan. I wrote some pieces for Project Censored dispatches that were sent around, and also some pieces for Fair. And I'm kind of consistently write for both of those publications. And that kind of turned into a book. So the book is actually available on pre-order now, and it's going to be published by Or Books, a small independent press in New York City. And it's called The Complicit Lens, U.S. media coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza. So I covered the topics from the notorious rape story to the content analysis that came out about how Israeli deaths were magnified and used very evocative language, while Palestinians were reported in, with body counts and dehumanized in many different ways. I did a good chapter, I think, well, a longish chapter on the student encampments, and of course the fantastic renaming of Hamilton Hall into Hind Hall, in memory of the young girl killed in Gaza. And of course, there's then, Nolan, the notorious Netanyahu address before a joint session of Congress, and how media did not fact check one word of his repetition of Israeli Hasbara. And that is what the Israelis call the word for propaganda.
A moment ago you mentioned that you said that I think you called the famous rape story. And this has been a story, and when I say story, I mean the reporting on it, that was used consistently to really try and silence protesters or those who are questioning U.S. support for Israel. Can you explain to our audience about kind of that article that came out in the New York Times, and then how the New York Times would later kind of contradicted itself, and sort of where are we now? Like, what do we know about the rape allegations as far as you can tell now?
Sure. The rape story came out in late December 2024, and it was, 2023. And it was just before, and actually during, South Africa was presenting its case to the International Criminal Court, and it was written by a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, or he signed off on it, and it was two very unqualified co-authors that actually were very much connected to Israel and Israel, propaganda. Anyway, the rape story was making an argument about weaponizing rape, that Hamas weaponized the use of rape on October 7th. There wasn't one actual witness. There wasn't one person who gave testimony that they were raped. It was really written like trauma porn. It had a main character of a young woman in a little black dress, and the minute the rape story came out, it was revealed that they had gotten the family to participate with the New York Times reporting on her death against their wishes, and actually they said, well, we never claimed she was raped. We have no evidence that she was raped, and we are shocked that this came out. And and they actually said this is a media scam. So many people have written about this story, and first of all, they never define what the weaponization of rape even means, and there's absolutely no forensic evidence that shows any of the things they included all along with Israeli Hasbara, of course, in the demonization of Hamas and Palestinians, were the fabricated uh, atrocity propaganda of babies with their heads chopped off, and this rape story should be seen in view of that and in light of that. Also, the main sources of that story was an organization called Zaka, and Zaka is an orthodox religious organization that actually had sued the Israeli government not to do, so that they wouldn't have to do um, autopsies or any forensic evidence before putting people in the ground. So the story has been debunked. Finally, the Sunday Times uh, in the UK, two investigators reporter did the kind of final debunking of it, and that was the first time that it appeared in mainstream media. But Kamala Harris on the floor of the Democratic Convention and elsewhere kept repeating that Hamas was responsible for mass rape on October 7th.
And I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival.
A story that was widely debunked and never reported so in the U.S. press.
We have to abide by international humanitarian law. That is just my fundamental belief. And that at the end of the day, what we need is a lasting coalition that is not going to be formed if Israel continues to do what they are doing. And the United States cannot be backers of this kind of indiscriminate bombing. That is my firm belief. We should have conditions on military aid in the same way that we do for every other country.
I want to ask you about sexual violence. And it's kind of remarkable that this issue hasn't gotten enough attention globally. Widespread use of rape, brutal rape, sexual violence against Israeli women by Hamas. I've seen a lot of progressive women, generally speaking, they're quick to defend women's rights and speak out against using rape as a weapon of war, but downright silent on what we saw on October 7th and what might be happening inside Gaza right now to these hostages. Why is that?
I mean, I don't know that that's true. I think
we see this consistently where there are mistruths or baseless statements or outright lies to drive people to support war, and then it's only years after the destruction is done that everyone kind of admits it's false. Like I remember just a year or two ago, I was watching Jeopardy because I'm 40 now, and that's what you do. And when I was watching it, the WMDs, the fact that the WMDs was a lie was a answer on Jeopardy. So it's like everyone accepts it now 20 years later.
Right.
But after these thousands of people have died. So I see an analogy there. And for the audience, maybe wondering why I'm going through this, but I want to point out that there's been a consistent inconsistencies in reporting. We can start with the rape story. We can also talk about like CNN having all their stories go through their Jerusalem bureau, or some of the problems about reporting as hospitals as part of like military efforts by Hamas. But I also want to talk about the student encampments, because that one I thought was particularly important. The way the media covered those student encampments, I think was a big wake-up call for a lot of activists. I don't think they realized how quickly they could be misrepresented and crushed with the media narratives. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the reporting of these student encampments last spring?
Sure. While members of the U.S. State Department were quitting the State Department over the genocide, and while polls consistently were showing by that time that the American public wanted a ceasefire very badly, and that also they wanted arms to Israel to actually go along with United States law. And we have the Leahy law on the books that's been policy for years, that the United States cannot send military weapons and aid to a government that's violating human rights. We have employed that law, and we employed it in the past in numerous countries, but it's something that was never done for Israel. And of course, we know that by that time, it was understood that Israel was engaged in genocide, and the UN and other sources were saying, you've got to stop this. A couple months later, the arrest warrants would be sent out for Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. So all of this is going on. It's very much part of U.S. mainstream dialogue at that point. Before the election came in, it bounced Gaza off of out of the news cycle. And what the media decided to go with was that the students were being influenced by outside agitators and foreign ideologies. That there were a number of other kind of media frames and tropes that were used, but the outside agitators and the foreign ideology was one that took hold in the media. I think because of that time, it had become pretty obvious to many people that the anti-Semitism argument, if you criticize the state of Israel in the middle of a genocide, you're anti-Semitic. That wasn't very effective anymore. That was wobbled. So then it became the outside agitators. What was also very disturbing was the connection between the New York Police Department and their counterterrorism unit with an adjunct professor that worked for Israeli counterintelligence and was, actually I say, employed by the university and working with the NYPD. And I believe that's where the outside agitator came from, was this counterterrorism unit and what was going on at the time. So the complex of law enforcement, the university, and the kind of collaboration and interconnection between those two things, together with the universities now, that Rashid Khalidi, the well-known Columbia professor who wrote the book the 100 Years War on Palestine, and he came out and said, look, faculty were once the designers of curriculum. Students came to the university to work with certain faculty, and it's as higher ed, we're about a full humanitarian kind of type of liberal education in which we learn how to be critical and be citizens. That idea of a university has fallen over the last 2-3 decades, as particularly private universities, especially like Columbia in New York City, have given way to being primarily directed by hedge funds and real estate moguls. So you've got the falling and failing focus from faculty and students in these institutions. They become a little more than financial institutions for these big hedge funds. And now they're connected with the military surveillance industrial complex. And so all of these things came together around the student encampments and the response. And then, of course, what they were met with when they went back onto campus in the fall.
Okay, thank you. And this is that's a good primer of this coverage from October 7th up until the election. And this is what I want to get. I know people are saying, like, Trump's in office now. Why are we going back over this? Well, the reason why is, Trump, I think, shocked a lot of people in terms of his claim that the U.S. was somehow going to overtake Gaza, and he's been very opaque in what that means. I mean, that's very typical Trump. But I think you've said this publicly. We've certainly talked about it privately. There's a belief that Harris would have done better, if not won, if she had distanced herself from Biden and fought for a ceasefire and at least showed any interest in the lives of Palestinians. And so I think that was a conclusion that a lot of folks drew. But now, in the context of President Donald Trump talking about the U.S. taking over Gaza, a lot of folks in Democratic leaning media have kind of rewritten that history to attack peace activists and uncommitted voters and DNC critics by arguing that somehow if these people who were critical of Biden's approach to Israel cost themselves the election and cost themselves at a potential opportunity of peace and better lives for the Palestinians. What do you say to all that? You watch this history in real time. I mean, what do you think? Do the Democrats have a point here?
I think it's a rank rewriting of history, Noel, and I agree with you on that point. At the Democratic convention, we knew that the uncommitted voters went they were 75,000. There were 30 of them, and they represented 750,000 voters from primarily swing states who had put uncommitted and were on the convention floor 2 months before the convention, absolutely begging the Democratic Party to allow them to have a speaker on the floor of the convention. They could vet they could vet the speeches. They had a wide variety of people to choose from. One was an American Palestinian woman, a doctor who had been in Gaza and could really testify to the suffering of the Palestinians there. And right up until the last day of the convention, they equivocated and finally told them no. It was a huge blow to that movement. Having said that, and let's not forget what Kamala Harris said on the convention floor. The same things, everybody says, well, gosh, she would have been better for a ceasefire. Well, that was kind of a false promise hanging out there. Everything went worse and worse. Extermination in northern Gaza, what the State Department always, what we need is a ceasefire. We're the 10-yard line. We're almost there. Oh, look, we're getting to a ceasefire. This lasted for months and months. So that Kamala Harris was working for a ceasefire was part of that same administration. But what happened is that she got up on the convention floor, made the kind of good liberal, more soft-toned, kind of faux empathy for the Palestinians, and then immediately said, but Israel has a right to defend itself from these horrible terrorists called Hamas who rape women and also massacred all of the young people at the music festival. There's so much wrong with that. I don't even know where to start, Nolan. First of all, we'd already talked about the rape story. But the fact is that since October 7th, investigative journalists and actually mainstream publications in Israel, Haaretz, Times of Israel, Ynet, some of Channel 12, some of the most mainstream sources in Israel have exposed that the IDF called in the Hannibal Directive. There were Israeli pilots in US-supplied Apache helicopters taking out cars, anybody on the way to the border, they took them out. There were hostages with Hamas, but also there were a lot of people trying to run every which way to get out of the music festival. And of the 364, we don't know how many were killed by Israeli helicopters, but the damage done to most of the image of burnt out cars and burned bodies, that was from Apache helicopter fire. That was not Hamas. And the early, incitement and the early revving up to get it to justify Israel's completely disproportionate what they plan to do in Gaza after October 7th. All of that October 7th narrative contributed to that. And that has been so widely connected, and that is to say, connected and reworked and corrected. And the alternative narrative is out there in so many places, but not in the United States. The United States never corrected that. And nobody ever corrected the rape story. So as late as the election, you can have Kamala Harris talking about the original October 7th story, where no Hannibal directive is involved, none of the damage done by Israeli forces, and you can have the rape story. And I believe that was the most important aspect, that showed that Kamala Harris had no intention of pulling away from the Biden administration policies in Gaza. I'll just say one more thing. I mean, the recent poll about a month ago, Nolan, you came out where, first of all, Democrats who voted for Biden in 2020 had a poll finally did a pretty good analysis and asked, why didn't you come out, and what was the top on your list? 30% of those people said that Gaza was their top priority, that they just didn't feel like coming out for the Democratic Party because of Gaza. Foreign policy in elections is actually unheard of, to have that much influence. All of the domestic things, the economy, work, housing, all of that stuff historically is much more important. But now you've actually got people telling the Democrats that, and basically people didn't suddenly move over and vote for Donald Trump, who had voted for Biden. No, they just didn't get the vote out. It was up to the Democratic Party to get the vote out. And who wants to come out and vote for a party that's currently engaged in genocide? That was a tough one.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure the Democrats will take self-responsibility and do some reflection. I'm kidding, of course. You said something else interesting in there about that I wanted to get to before we get to Trump, which is you were talking about the Israeli press. And tell me what you think, at least in my kind of like anecdotal experience during the post-October 7th events. I seem to think the Israeli press did a better job of criticizing Israel and covering protests against Benjamin Netanyahu than anything we saw here in the U.S. And if I'm right in that, and you tell me, I think that helped explain why so many in Congress wanted to ban, like platforms like TikTok that wouldn't play ball. They were allowing that like Israeli press coverage and other coverage from around the world that was empathetic to the plight of the Palestinians on their platform. So what do you think about that? Did you have the same kind of read of some of the Israeli press?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, especially Haaretz, which is Israel's oldest newspaper, and also it's had a pretty liberal stance for all this time. They've been critical of the right-wing shift toward the government, right-wing shift in the government, and they've called out, the attempts to alter the judiciary and all that stuff. But they're really speaking to a number of Israelis now. Not to say that Israel is against the genocide. Israelis are mad because they didn't get their hostages back. Their people, the kibbutzim on the border, sustained terrible damage and loss of life. And also Israelis don't feel safe anymore. This movement toward the right wing and the constant underlying foundation that is the motivation behind Israeli policy now to keep annexing and taking Palestinian land grab after land grab, has been going on for years. That ultimately makes peace impossible in the region and also makes Israelis much less safe. And really October 7th was the culmination of this. So they're mad at that. So Haaretz speaks to those constituents. It speaks to that sentiment, and it actually allows a dialogue. The editors there, Gideon Levy being one, longtime good journalists. They haven't let their journalists, they didn't take people even off Channel 12. Channel 12 has connections to Netanyahu's family. There was a young woman named Yasmin Porat during October 7th who was captured and then witnessed at Kibbutz Be'eri the slaughter of some of the hostages by Israeli forces. That was all over on all of the main networks. Her interviews, and you can look at them. They're translated into English, and the commentator says, "You mean the fire came from Israel?" She goes, "Yes, friendly fire. There was a lot of fire." "You mean that the IDF was responsible for killing the hostages?" "Yes, they definitely killed the hostages." And did you hear anybody on American media say anything like that?
No, great, good point. And so, so that Donald Trump takes office, and folks will remember that there had been rumors coming out of his campaign that he wanted a ceasefire right as he took office. Not necessarily because he cared about the Palestinians, but some people assumed at the time that the war in Israel would be a distraction from his real agenda. So he wanted it closed down so he could get focused on his agenda. But nonetheless, when he gets in office, shortly before that, you get the announcement of this ceasefire, which is not really a ceasefire. But Trump now is talking about how the Palestinians can't return. He's arguing that he's concerned for their safety. There's too many bombs on the ground, so we're going to build some other place for them, and it's going to be so great. They're not going to want to come back, and Gaza is going to be transformed into this area.
No, they don't want to return to Gaza. If we could give them a home in a safer area, the only reason they're talking about returning to Gaza is they don't have an alternative. When they have an alternative, they don't want to return to Gaza. If they had a home that was safe, where you don't have Hamas threatening them, killing them, torturing them, they'd rather not return to Gaza. But right now, Gaza is the only alternative. As far as the other regions, the only reason they maybe don't act enthusiastic is...
So, I mean, there's a lot to say about Trump there, but I'm actually interested in a different question, which is, what do you think is going to be kind of the political strategy for Americans who are concerned about the plight of Palestinians? Because, I think at this point it's very clear the Democratic Party is not interested in helping the folks in Gaza, and it seems like Trump has made it very clear the Republican Party is not either. Where do you see this going? I mean, what do you think is going to happen in terms of like these movements and this energy for it? What do you anticipate people are going to do?
That is a tough question, Nolan, and I'd like to maybe just redirect it a tiny bit, because I think what we understand from Trump is he's into chaos, and he put that Gaza plan out, and it got a massive pushback. So I think that that's all up in the air. There was a point where Israel had said, "Okay," that very well-known settler woman, Danielle Yetzi, whatever her name is, she was saying, we're deliberately emptying out Gaza because we're going to go and resettle that, and that was a promise to the very right-wing settler movement. But when the Palestinians, I'm sure you saw the footage online of the massive people walking, just an incredible display of humanity heading back into northern Gaza that has been completely destroyed. So this kind of, we're taking our land back, but also the horrible reality of getting back there and finding that they don't have homes and anything anymore. But I think we have to take into account the absolute indomitable spirit of the Palestinians. And they have no intentions of leaving Gaza. So they're not going to go. I also think that the ceasefire that Trump became folklore about, his ambassador that flew into Israel and told Benjamin Netanyahu that he wasn't going to wait for the end of Sabbath, and he wanted to talk to him now, and he was going to, he strong-armed him, he twisted his arm and his back, really playing into Trump's strongman representative in American popular culture. if you look at what was happening in northern Gaza and Rafah, if you look at Hamas's own Telegram accounts, if you look at some of the Substack where Hamas reports about what the battles have been like, Hamas continued to take on Israeli troops in northern Gaza and in Rafah, even under these attacks. So there's this concern now that there's all these ordinances that are in Gaza. Well, those very weapons are the ones that Hamas takes off Israeli soldiers. They use them and they reuse them and they send them back to Israel. So Gaza, so Hamas, and of course there was a brilliant, you might have seen that brilliant PR strategy during the release of the 4 Israeli hostages in Gaza City, where amidst the rubble, they've got Zionism will not win. Hundreds of armed, masked fighters and Palestinians around in this triumph of getting their people back with these 4 Israelis that they put in uniform with this massive message that all these people weren't civilians. A good portion of them were some active duty military. Others were settlers. Others were off duty. So Hamas and the Palestinians, they don't intend to leave Gaza. And I think that's going to have to come into it somewhere. The Israelis, in terms of surveillance, we're talking about surveillance. There was one proposal that there would be kind of like, prison camps or concentration camps where big tech would come in and supply all of the facial recognition and technologies to track each Palestinian, how much food and humanitarian aid they were given, and track them as they move around in the camp, which is exactly, Nolan, what's happened now in Columbia University. Mm-hmm. So you see these similar technologies being used to repress students and repress Gazans.
Oh, Robin, I really appreciate it. Where can folks follow your work if they want to learn more?
Well, the book is going to be out soon. Actually, some of the things, quite a few of the things that we talked about, Nolan, I've written in my Al Jazeera columns. Now they're published in Arabic, but I think some of my friends have found them in Arabic and then use Google Translate. So I would look there, but also the book is just getting through the editing process and it's going to production. So I'm going to be having time to jump back in. I've been pretty much out of it for about 6 months now, trying to finish up the book, but I'll be around. But you can find the Al Jazeera columns. I think I covered the Democratic Convention, the vote, the election, and most recently Trump's strong arming to get the ceasefire passed.
All right. Well, Robin Andersen, it is a pleasure. I'm sure we will have you back on as more of this story develops and others. Check out Robin's work. She's great. Thank you for being on the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Disinfo Detox wherever you get your podcasts. Detox complete.